Council. A brief profile for Issa Manager, a position he held from 2016 to 2023. Before that, he worked as a broadcast journalist for the BBC World Service for 10 years and was also assistant editor at the Daily Trust newspaper. He has also led various human rights projects and trained human rights defenders across Nigeria. He holds a bachelor's degree in English from Bayero University, Kano, and a master's in journalism from the University of London's Birkbeck College. Issa Sanusi is, however, unavoidably absent and is represented by Dr. Aminu Ayatu as one of the discussants of our first seminar paper. May I therefore humbly invite Dr. Aminu Ayatu, a conflict researcher in Amnesty International Nigeria, to please join the Executive Governor on stage. A brief profile of Ms. Julie Wang Sanda. Ms. Julie Sanda is a principal research fellow and training coordinator at the Center for Strategic Research and Studies, National Defense College, Nigeria, where she has been a researcher since 1997. Currently, Ms. Sanda is on a one-year sabbatical fellowship at the Legislative Center for Security Analysis of the National Institute for Legislative and Democratic Studies, where she supports the work of the new center in analyzing and shaping security policy and legislative-specific interventions towards enhancing peace and security. Her interests include, amongst others, gender and security, national security policy, foreign policy and peacekeeping, and she has several publications to her credit. Ms. Sanda teaches foreign policy and civil military relations at the Bingham University, Karu, on a pro bono basis, and continues to mentor younger women in the security sector, both academics and operatives. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, may I have the singular honor to invite Ms. Sanda to the stage as one of our discussants for the first paper.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abel. To moderate the discussion of the first paper will be Professor Balasom Etham Major. Professor Major is a professor of political science in the Department of Political Science and head of the Center for Research Monitoring and Coordination Office in Nigerian Defense Academy. Professor Major joined the service of Nigerian Defense Academy in October 1990 and has served the Academy as an academic staff for over 33 years, during which he rose from the ranks, beginning as a graduate assistant to become the first fully made by Nigerian Defense Academy Professor of Political Science. With over 75 scholarly publications, Professor Major is published and read in academic and scholarly circles on all continents of the world. Professor Major is married to Naomi, and they are blessed with 3 children. I will now hand over to Professor Major to moderate this discussion session. Professor.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid our time is fast spent, and I wouldn't like to take any much more of our time. So what we'll do is simply going straight onto the discussions. But before then, let me quickly say that today is an extraordinary day in the history of the Defense Academy, given that in the line of events marked by the Academy to mark its 60th anniversary is the event we have just had, a very incisive narrative and engagement with the raging issue on the protection of civilians. Today, I have here with me, as part of the attempt by the Academy to join the global conversation on protection of civilians, erudite scholars, practitioners, and people who have their hands on the protection of civilians. Let me go quickly to begin to say, for instance, that His Excellency the Executive Governor have fully said it. What causes conflict is the absence of good governance. To protect civilians and to mitigate the causation of conflicts, therefore, he said, we have to engage and be good to make governance good in economic, political, socio-cultural, and all spheres of society. That way, we reduce the possibility of conflicts and as well the tendency to put civilians in the way of harm. I have the privilege, therefore, to quickly engage the panel of discussants here on these subject matters. Now, I would like to start with the Executive Governor of Taraba State, who was my student and the gift of the Academy to the world. The Department of Political Science has done so much for this country, and I think the Department of Geography too. Now, sir, you have been on both sides of the issues, in a military uniform and suddenly in a civilian garb today. What would you say are
full presentation on the protection of civilians in conflict zones? As a fellow graduate of this esteemed institution, with a journey that spans from 1990 to my voluntary retirement from active military service in 2010, I'm deeply invested in the subject matter that we're discussing today. Professor Zulum's presentation highlighted critical issues and challenges faced in ensuring the safety and well-being of civilians amid the chaos of armed conflict. Reflecting on my years of service and the sacrifices made by our brave men and women in uniform, I echo Professor Zulum's sentiment on the imperative of prioritizing civilian protection in all military operations. Our experiences on the battlefield have taught us invaluable lessons, and it is incumbent upon us to translate these lessons into concrete actions that safeguard the lives of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. In discussing the paper, I would like to emphasize the following point: localized solution. As someone that is intimately familiar with the dynamics of conflict in Nigeria, particularly in Borno State and the Niger Delta region, I want to say here that most of these conflicts, before they commenced, there were no proper coordination of intelligence. Particularly my experience in the Niger Delta, before we dive into the crisis in the Niger Delta, I was directed to write a threat analysis that would bring in how the operation was going to be conducted. And it didn't stop there. I was directed to join the task force as the intelligence officer attached to the task force. And that made it easier for the commander to be able to work with officers that have insight on situation on ground. And since we started that operation, we were able to at least deal with the situation in such a way that civilians in that area were protected. So I'm going to say here that it is important that we should tailor our protection strategy to the specific context and need of local communities. And I'm happy that my brother, the governor of Borno State, clearly stated here that in assessing the situations in Borno, he was able to hear, and they will continue.
Shed a little bit more light on this character of contemporary conflict and how these have come to pose a credible challenge to the protection of civilians, and possibly tell us what we can put in place to scale the obstacle of challenging situations for the protection of civilians. Sanda?
Thank you, the moderator. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I think His Excellency did a pretty good job in discussing, the character of contemporary conflict, and what has changed, of course, in what we used to know about conflict and what conflict is today, and the kind of challenges, therefore, that it throws up for protection of civilians. We know that quite a number of the conflicts that we have today engage so many non-state actors, and so these are what our military and security agencies are faced with, and we know the nature of non-state actors. They don't have to adhere to any international laws or any laws for that matter. They don't have to adhere to your rules of engagement and so on. And this is a big issue. I know many times when we discuss these issues, and military colleagues will be like, why are you always focusing on us, and not on. Well, we focus on the military because they are the ones who are legitimately licensed to use arms. They are an instrument of the state, and they are the ones who have the legitimate monopoly of instruments of violence. They are therefore the ones whom we can hold to account. They are professionals, and so you have to hold professionals to account. Now these other ones, the law applies to them, yes, but it is only when you are able to get hold of them. So this is a big challenge, out there. So they don't obey any rules, only the rules that they set, So, and they don't have, everybody's a target. Basically, anything that can be a target is a target. These are the difficulties that we deal with. Anything that can be a target is a target, which is what makes the issue of protection of civilians very salient and critical, when we're talking about contemporary armed conflict. That's why civilian casualties have become so high, and we have to have this huge focus now on protection of civilians. Before, we used to hear that women and children are protected in times of war. That is no longer an issue. Today they are actually the targets. Before, civilian infrastructure were recognized as not targets, but this is where you are dealing with organized, irregular, combatants, forces. But now that it's a very fluid situation, civilian infrastructure, are targets. Hospitals are targets. Churches, mosques, places of worship, they're all targets. Schools are targets. So anything and everybody that can be a target is a target. So this is an issue. It also becomes difficult even for the regular and the state actors, particularly in a situation like what we have in our country today. And this is another point I want to bring about the nature of conflict now, that it's happening, a lot of the conflicts are within states. A lot of the conflicts are within states. And I know His Excellency talked about, the military and internal security operations and so on. So this is a challenge we have, that a lot of conflicts are within states. It used to be that Nigeria was a major peace contributor, troop contributor, because, we were going out to help with conflicts outside of our boundaries, of our borders. But today the conflicts are here. And so the military has had to turn inwards, not only to deal with conflict in one or two states, but all over the country. This is a big challenge. The other challenge then, in terms of protection of civilians in the kind of situation we have, is not only these, the state actors that, have the legitimacy to use force, and then the non-state actors who are unleashing violence over the place. But we also see the issue of non-state actors who are also security providers. So you have private providers or contractors, that are contracted, whether secretly or openly, by the state. We have, in the Borno model, we have the civilian JTF. All over the country now we see different variations of that playing out. Some are cooperating with state governments, some are, with local governments, some are community level, some forming themselves. So this proliferation is adding to the complexity of what we have to deal with in protection of civilians. I remember His Excellency kept saying, who is harming the civilians? So you can't, it's complex. Everybody, is implicated in one way or the other. But then, so this is an important aspect we have to bring in also, is the issue of private security and vigilantes and so on. Of course, the issue of humanitarians has been eloquently put forward by the governor. They play a very important role, but there are also challenges that come with having them all over the place, especially when there's no regulation and proper coordination, with what they are doing on the ground. And then some of the protection activities that go on, are they really what the people require on the ground? How are these determined? How are they delivered? These are also challenges. His Excellency talked about coordination, which is very important. Coordination is not intuitive. It doesn't just happen. It has to be deliberate. It has to be planned. Who must take the lead? The government must take the lead. The political actors must take the lead. I see Professor Mija looking at me. So it's like my time is up. But I just want to emphasize the primacy of the political, and which is what we see coming clearly in the Borno model. The political leader must take the lead. There must be that commitment. He or she must lead the team in terms of the thinking, the visioning, but also in overseeing. And he's a very hands-on person. We saw that with him. And I don't know if I'm going to have a chance to say this later, but I must say before I close this section, is that we need to codify what happened in Borno State, because the issue of lessons learned is something that we need to do much better with, in terms of the kind of challenges that we're dealing with in our context today. Thank you, Prof.
I am getting more engrossed in this conversation. Madam Sanusi, I want to draw into the conversation now. I think that the lead presenter made it very clear that there is no absence of laws, but there is the problem of compliance in conflict, and even in the last stages of the stage 4 of conflict, when civilians are herded, so to say, into displaced persons camps and matters like that, we still observe that there are right violations in spite of all of the issues that you have engrossed in the international human rights laws and laws of engagement and what of that. What would you add to this narrative on this subject?
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Mija, and I'm delighted very much to speak on the paper presented by the comrade governor. And I think, well, it's important for us from the beginning to understand. I think one of the central issues I have really deduced from that paper is the Prof's ability to really represent the notion of contemporary protection of civilians as against what may be seen as classical. So all of the security agents in Nigeria and the Nigerian state itself need to understand and appreciate this evolving, connotation and conceptualization of that protection of civilians. What it used to be in the past, is simply that there is either a standing army or a security apparatus of the Nigerian state, which is there just to protect the killing of civilians. That's part of the initial social contract between the people in the state and the governors in the state. But it has gradually evolved to become something more complex than that, which entails issues of protection prior to conflict, during conflict, and even in the post-conflict times. And the protection of human rights also entails the protection of the rights of civilians during the conflict and after the conflict, which is very important, and I think which is a notion that is overlooked because of the evolution of that understanding of contemporary protection of civilians. In the contemporary protection of civilians, what it means is that it has to start with the protection of the displacement of civilians. Once there is a conflict in place, it is not just to protect civilians from being killed by armed groups or any perpetrator of violence, but also the ability of the security apparatus to protect the displacement. And where displacements become necessary, and they happen, it is the protection, it's the right of the security apparatus to ensure that there is adequate provision of internally displaced persons camps and their protection within the camps. And I'm happy that the professor has actually, hammered on this point repeatedly on the cases of corruption that are found in the IDP camps, on the cases of sexual abuse, and even attacks by, some of those who are responsible for the protection of civilians. And I think in all these stakes, the rights of civilians are actually, involved, and which has to be taken up by whoever has signed an oath to protect the civilians. So it's not just about protection of civilians in terms of killings. And I think that the more we appreciate this contemporary term of, civilian protection, the cutting-edge thoughts about civilian protection, I think in all of these stakes, those apparatuses that are responsible for the protections of civilians will put all the mechanisms in place to be able to ensure that these protections happen on civilians. And I think the second aspect of this argument is that the Prof is able to say that it's not just the business of the security apparatus within the state, it's also the business of all stakeholders, including even civilians themselves. Because we've seen cases in Nigeria where we have informers from the civilian population and who can hardly be extracted from the civilian population. So it's very important that we appreciate this as a contemporary notion of civilian protection in conflict. And then the post-conflict recovery and resettlement is very important, and you've seen how in the paper the governor has been able to say that he has put it upon himself that before the end of his tenure, he would make sure that all IDP camps are closed and resettled back to their ancestral homes. And this is very important. So we need to look at this, even in terms of where there are mistaken, atrocities that are carried out either mistakenly or deliberately. The need for accountability is very important in the protection of civilians in conflict. It's not just about just saying that, people have been resettled or have been taken back to their ancestral homes. It's also a question of accountability in terms of those who take responsibility for what might have happened.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just take you on one of the issues that you're bringing into policy cycle, the concern with education, with health, for children and for civilians in conflict areas?
Yes, you know, and thank you, Prof. Major, for this question, because it's very important.